Today I'm speaking with Wren Story. Wren, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very glad to finally meet you. I've been friends with you on Facebook, I think, for at least a year and a half or so, but I'm glad to finally meet you and hear your story in more detail. I know a little bit about what you do, but I know you're a very busy person. And I'm going to, on that note, start with your bio. Wren is from Connecticut, but she currently lives in Whitehall, New York. She is a neurodivergent adoptee, which we'll hear more about shortly. She's the mother of six. She is a domestic violence survivor and a chronic illness warrior. She was raised as an independent fundamental Baptist, and she was graduated from Pensacola Christian College. Wow. After deconstruction, she was graduated from Finger Lakes School of Massage. She's a digital creator focusing on deconstruction from religion, teaching human worth, and she has her own digital magazine and collab book series based on human rights declarations called Simply Being, and that being is BEE, like a buzzing bee. It's basically an anti-propaganda magazine for social healing. She's also working on an autobiography, and next year will be part of a docuseries called 100 Women. She's also the author of Kaleidoscope Island, a fantasy short story about the origins of the world. You can find that ebook on her website, which I'll have the link beneath this video. Wren focuses a lot on Christian nationalism, individuality, mental health, PTSD, and other related topics. She is passionate about moving humanity through our existential crisis with hopes of a better future, especially for future generations. So, with that bio, free to add anything that I missed, and then tell us more about yourself.
Thank you. I think a lot of what our background is really important to the general society because so much of how society runs is intertwined with religion and cults and how that's infused with white supremacy and all of that, and it just bleeds out into the rest of society and how we interact with each other. And while our stories may come as a shock, like people can't believe other people live this way because it's so extreme. Um, it's still very much a part of society and still affects them, even if they don't have any direct experience with these extreme cults. And being in it, my whole purpose and mission has been to take all these extreme beliefs and to see how it's been infused into society, and how can we reverse that, right, into something that's bent towards healing and justice. And yeah, to decondition ourselves from, even though these extreme beliefs may not affect the entire population, but it indirectly does.
Hmm.
And so that's why I have a whole variety of different topics and stuff, because it affects every area of our life.
Yeah, really does. Well, before we get into the sort of the meat of your story, could you tell us something totally fun, your hobbies, or something quirky about yourself to break the ice?
Well, I think a lot of my quirkiness has a lot to do with being neurodivergent.
Okay.
And like I scream a lot, like if so, I get startled really easily. So sometimes, like, people come in or behind me or something, and I'll just like scream. And I have like made a lot of people like cry and like scared themselves. It's
Hmm.
really funny. But yeah, a lot of, I don't know, my entire existence is my work and my kids and my home. I don't have a whole lot of like hobbies, and it's just my quirkiness is more, I think, due to autism and ADHD.
Yeah. Well, I'm the father of four kids, not six. So I've got two fewer than you, but I know how busy you can get. I know that when you're working, especially as a content creator, there's just not much time. So I can definitely relate to that. How old are your kids, by the way, in terms of
Ages
range?
15 to 3.
Okay. Wow. That's a busy house.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for helping us, get acquainted there with your bio and your other stuff. But we definitely love to invite people to share their stories. We ask people to go back to the earliest days that you remember and talk about, how your worldview was shaped. How did you get involved with Christianity, and just how did it slowly evolve to, to where you are today?
Yeah, thank you. A big part of my story and how it affected me and shaping my worldview was my earliest memories, my core development was being adopted and how that affected me and how I viewed the world. Um,
At what age did that happen?
I was officially adopted at age 3. Um, my story is unique. It's not, I mean, every story is unique, right? But it's not a typical adoption story. I wasn't in an orphanage. There is no agency. I wasn't adopted straight from birth. It was very unusual, my adoption. Um, and it goes back to my parents, right? And their story. My mother was a bus kid. And for those who don't know, in church, not every church has a bus ministry either, but especially in the IFB, Independent Fundamental Baptist churches, they have a bus ministry which goes around and picks up all the kids from the neighborhoods, and they just load them on the bus and bring them to church. So my mother was a bus kid, and my father was not diagnosed back then because they didn't understand autism or neurodivergence or anything, right? That was a different time and a different era. But he did not present typically um, for developmental milestones. And so you could tell that there was something off, not quite right with him, but no one knew what it was. Um, and so he struggled in life, and my mom struggled in life. And so they thought, oh, this is a great idea to put them together. and and they got a lot of help from our church, but not enough, right? I mean, when you're struggling that bad, it's hard. And so they did get a lot of help, but it still wasn't enough. And my adoptive parents were the ones that really took them under their wing. And when my birth parents' marriage started falling apart, they asked my adoptive parents, who were basically my babysitters, if they could take us on, me and my brother and my sister, while they were working on their marriage or whatever, which was very strange looking back on it, but okay. Um, and they said, well, we can't take all 3 of them, but we'll take her. And I was in the middle of 3 siblings. And I don't know why the adults all thought that was a great idea, but that's what happened. And all 3 of us ended up getting split up into different homes.
Mm.
And then their marriage completely fell apart, and it just kind of turned into adoption. And so my brother was adopted out, I was adopted out, and then my sister ended up staying with my birth mom for a while. So that's kind of the story behind how my adoption happened, and it was not intentional. It just kind of flowed into that. But
That's still a
as
lot of
a,
disruption though at that age.
yeah, like as a toddler, that's confusing, and I remember thinking, like, I need to be on my absolute best behavior because I don't want to lose my family again. And I blamed myself. I thought it was my fault because I stressed out my mom too much and she couldn't handle life. And so it became my goal to not stress anyone out. Like, don't be a burden, don't cause stress, be a good girl, and just do what you're told. And I strove for goodness and perfection in however I was supposed to, whatever was expected of me, because I didn't want to lose my family, and I didn't want my home disrupted again. So,
Hmm. That's a lot.
yeah, and I was a toddler. And it's crazy because people think kids don't know what's going on. They just are happy playing. And, we talk a lot about kids are so resilient. And my rebuttal for that, if kids are so resilient, how come so many adults have so much PTSD from their childhood? How come it affects us so much?
Yeah.
Like, we're not. And kids are smarter than we think that they are. And I even remember I had thoughts about my place in the home um, when I was a baby. I remember sitting in an infant car seat and having thoughts about me and my home life, which is insane and mind blowing. And I've only met like a few people that have memories like that. But babies think their brain works just the same as an adult's does.
Hmm.
Um, so
Wow.
yeah, I that also really shaped how I view my kids and how I interact with my own kids. Um, there's a lot of different parenting styles out there. I say mine is respectful parenting, based on the dignity of my kids. And yeah, I give them a whole lot more credit than most adults do.
Hmm. That's so
But
much just hearing your story without you digging into more details. Yeah, that's so much for a young child to bear. And you think about, like I think about my kids, and at that age, you want the biggest concern on their table to be, do I have Cheerios tonight, or some other cereal, and what book are we going to read? To have those kind of deep, profound questions at that age is kind of disturbing. Really, it's heartbreaking to hear.
yeah, and not every child does either. A lot of it is based on personality. Like some people don't have a whole inner dialogue, like everyone's inner workings is so different. So like some kids really don't know what's going on and are completely fine with it. But you just don't know at that age, because there's no way to know. Um, I don't know. But yeah, kids are smarter than we think that they are.
Yeah,
Um,
but you were
and it
getting
was,
through that. You were getting exposed to Christianity.
oh yeah. Yeah, again, I was born into Christianity, right, in the church, and then I was adopted within the church. So I call myself a church baby because I mean, I was like passed around and everyone babysat me and my grandmother, my birth mother's mother, she was saved at a Billy Graham's concert, or Billy Graham crusade back in the day. And I was it was part of the way of life. Also say I didn't have a chance because I got it from both my biological and my adoptive families.
Mm.
Yeah.
And was the message of Christianity a major part of your focus at that time, or was this the adoption and family stuff kind of overwhelming and much more of the focus? Like, or another way, I guess you'd say, when did Christianity become a big deal to you? You're not, I shouldn't say Christianity. When did your walk with Christ become a big deal?
It's interesting because um, having been adopted, having been raised in Christianity, it really it is a core developmental trauma, means it affects your development. Um, and for those of us who have experienced the complex trauma, we don't really know who we were before that, right? Because there never really was a before. We were just kind of thrown into it. Um, and so I think I'm really this past year have really been digging into like memories that I suppressed and and asking myself that question, right? Of when did I really start getting heavy into it? And who was I before I believed? And I do remember one time where I remember thinking, and this is a memory that I suppressed until like recently, that I remember thinking like the adults believe this stuff, but it's really stupid. Like I didn't like I had no respect for the religion at all. I was like, I cannot believe all the adults in my life believe this. And I was like, I don't know, you guys are crazy. Like I was not having any part of it, but that trauma from being a good girl and wanting to people please and wanting to please my mom. I remember being in the back seat of the car. I must have been 4, maybe 5. And I was like, I'm going to make my mom happy today, my adoptive mom. And I remember I told her, like, Mom, I got saved today. I asked Jesus in my heart. And she was like, You did? When? When did that happen? Like, tell me about it. And she's like, How? Did your teachers help you? I said, No, I did it by myself. And she was like, Wow, that's so great. And in that Christian circle, there's a heavy focus on your testimony, which is when you became a believer, right? When is the date? There's always like this, when was the date of when you got saved? And Christian parents seem to wear their children's testimony as like a badge of honor, right? Because they're like, they want to secure their child's place in heaven. So,
Yeah.
at the earliest age where children show an interest in Jesus, it's like the parents just grab a hold of that and just keep that in their heart and they just won't let it go. So my adoptive
Sure.
mom did the same thing, and she told everyone, like I remember her telling that story all the time, and she's like, and then Ren said, I did it by myself, you know? And so I remember that story, but what I hadn't remembered was how that came about anyway. I didn't actually believe, and I remember like feeling so guilty about it for so many years that I essentially like lied to my mom about it, and then she grabbed a hold of it, you know. But what I hadn't remembered my entire life was how I actually thought about it, which I didn't actually believe. And but wanting to please my parents and having gone through that adoption trauma really started to shape me and
Hmm.
how I interacted with Christianity.
So as a child, you were feeling like if you made this public profession, then you would be more secure and safe in your home life.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, you had to play the part. If like that was your entire world. And if you didn't believe that, that's going to be pretty awkward existence for the next, like, 16 years or whatever.
Yeah, especially the. I mean, I don't know if the kid would think this line of thinking, but just the thought of theoretically could my adoptive family think I'm not a good choice and try to get rid of me, and then I go into
Exactly.
family 3 or 4. It's even if that wouldn't actually happen, it's hard to even think about how a child would see that kind of stuff. And I remember one interview I did, a guy was saying something similar where he just felt like everything that he did as a child mattered in the sense that he just felt like anything that bad that happened in their family was going to be his fault. And like he talked about he prayed for his grandma to get healed of cancer or something, and it didn't happen, and she died. And he took it personally, like God listens to you if you are in a right relationship with him, but if you're sinning, he doesn't hear your prayers. So the fact that he prayed, God says, if you have the faith of a mustard
Mhm.
seed, you can move mountains. Whatever you ask in faith, I will give to you. So it's like, okay, I didn't pray right, or I had sin in my heart when I tried to pray, so God didn't hear me. Therefore, my grandma died. And that's a different story from yours, but just different angles of saying to kids, you have so much pressure on you to get this just right, or else really catastrophic things could happen. And that's just like, oh my gosh. And the drive for us as parents to say, we want to give our kids a beautiful, hopefully somewhat dreamy childhood, just to like, play in the sunshine, and get fresh air and just enjoy being alive and move your body, and to have such horrifically, you know, just almost like the weight of the world is on your shoulders as a child. It's just it's hard to even wrap my mind around.
Yeah, and I do want to say that, like, have coming from a child's perspective, which does not have all the details, does not really understand anything, I don't believe that either my birth parents or my adoptive parents, placed that kind of pressure on me or gave me any kind of indication that they would abandon me or get rid of me or anything like that. I don't think, as far as my adoption trauma goes, I don't think that they placed the blame on me for anything. Like, that was all my doing, as a child. But again, not having, I think also is very developmentally appropriate for a child trying to understand cause and effect and their place in the world and trying to figure out, how does all this stuff work? And, like children, they build blocks and they knock them over and they're like, oh, if I do this, and then this will happen. And so it's very developmentally appropriate for children to think it must be my fault because of what's happening. Because
Yeah.
everything is, you know, that's all a child knows, is
Yeah.
how do I affect the world around me? But I don't think that was my parents as far as the adoption trauma goes. They weren't placing that on me. That was all me. Um,
But it is in the
but
era of Christianity a little bit. I
but
mean,
in
if you're in church.
Christianity, that's a different story. That is true, because even if my parents didn't say a word about Christianity to me, it was still in church, still down my throat. I still heard the gospel all the time. I still heard about how awful of a sinner I was, and that I needed Jesus. And um, it was still in my world 24/7. So, and that they wanted me to be raised in that. So they didn't even have to say anything to me regarding religion, because they willingly placed me. They wanted me to be in that environment, you
Yeah.
know.
And when you have that worldview, I should say the theology of God is looking at you constantly, and he does say, if you obey and do the right thing, I'll bless you. But if you don't, I'll curse you. And the curses are really significant, both in time and eternity. Like you just feel like remember the old Tom and Jerry cartoons where they're like an anvil, the big iron anvil with a rope. It's just like hanging over your head. And if the mouse cuts the rope, the anvil falls on the cat's head. It's like you feel like that, or the dark cloud concept, like it's just always following me. And at what point, and you can't, I mean, you can obviously keep up a facade sometimes for a while, but in your heart of hearts, if there's something divergent from what they're preaching and teaching and demanding versus what you actually believe and think about, the pressure is strong. I don't think I could relate to a lot of what you said, but I think definitely the more generic sense of just feeling like you clearly need to be a righteous person. And if you, be honest with yourself, because God sees you. You don't, you can't fool God. If God sees you and he's saying, you're not who you say you are, and you're not a righteous person right now, you just feel like even if you are truly like doing the right things, if you're not doing it with the right attitude, or if you've kind of added in any kind of like, I'm doing this in my own human power, my own pride, or whatever, any self-righteousness, it just, you feel like somebody's gonna see behind the veil and see I'm a fraud. And when you live like that for
Right.
years, it does a lot of damage.
Right. It's hard because it's such an abstract concept that, and there's no way to prove anything. Like, I think a lot of us who grew up in it had salvation anxiety or something, that I don't know how many of us like got saved all over again, where you said the prayer, but it wasn't good enough last time. I have to say it again, and um there's a lot of anxiety around that. Like, am I saved? Am I not? I asked Jesus into my heart, but is that enough? or, like you said, am I a fraud? I think I do remember a lot of sermons where they almost like they're trying to dispute an unbeliever's idea of God being this being in the sky who's watching everything and is ready to strike lightning down on you, right? And I remember them trying to disprove that, but I also remember sermons that glorified like the old preacher like Jonathan Edwards, where he was like, you're hanging on by a thread like over the fire or something, and any moment God could, just cut that thread and off you go. And it's like it's very very hypocritical, to kind of to invalidate that's the message that people receive from Christianity while also preaching that at the same time.
Yeah.
And they present this abstract, unprovable problem that all humans are born in sin and are destined to be thrown into eternal fire because we deserve that kind of extreme punishment, right? So they make up this problem that nobody can prove. And then they create this solution that, again, nobody can prove. And then they say, oh, now you're good. Now you're clean. And so they take you from you are a dirty sinner to now you are clean and righteous before God. And all you have to do is be humble and admit how terrible you are and ask God to forgive you. And now you're fine. And oh man, I think it preys a lot on people's natural insecurity. And, there's this Bible verse where it says like men with itching ears or something that they just tell, like the preachers are just telling them what they want to hear. And I feel that the gospel and the fact of telling people that they are dirty, rotten sinners on their way to hell, I think that is telling people what they want to hear, is validating how awful they are because that's how they feel inside. Because we can never be good enough because the standard for all of us is way too high. And just among our peers and just in social standards alone. And so we do mess up all the time and we do want to be better than we are, or I hope that we do, right? And the gospel preys on people's insecurities that way and then gives them this abstract solution that only the church can provide. And then they're like, yep, now you're good to go. And you never have to think about that again. Like you never have to, like, you just latch on to that date that you were saved and Jesus washed away your sin and you are good to go forever now. And like we were saying, a lot of us that grew up this way, we didn't feel that confident that it was that easy. I think a lot of probably because we're all still getting in trouble because we were kids. You know what I mean? Like we still had a lot of pressure for performance and all of that. And the parenting, the traditional parenting that a lot of us that grew up in conservative church circles like that was the complete opposite of what the gospel even stood for. Yeah. Meaning, you were bad, but now you're good and you're good forever. Traditional parenting did not enforce that. So we were constantly having to be performance-based every single day. And then we would get in church and be like, oh, but it's not work-based, it's grace-based. And it's like, it's so confusing. Like what are we supposed to think?
And I think a lot of them too mixed in the other side of praying, which is PREY, which is the idea of like there's this blessing that God desperately wants to give you, and there's just so much sin or ignorance or pride in your life that you just can't take it. But it's like a father who is, you know, hearing his kid screaming, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, please feed me. And the daddy's like right there with their favorite meal. You know, here's your chicken nuggets and your, you know, mac and cheese, you know, your peas just like you like them, like it's right here. But for some reason they're like screaming, you know, that they're hungry, and you're just like, it's like God's that daddy. He's just waiting to bless you. And for some reason, we're all apparently so thick and stupid and messing up so much that we can't see it. But it's like there's this secret. Not that my church would have described it as a secret, but it would have in fact said it's very much not a secret. But like this thing of you need to just keep pursuing God while knowing He's been pursuing you this whole time. And so if you feel the lack of the joy of the Lord, if you feel the lack of that warm embrace of He's your good, good Father, if you feel the lack of the peace that passes all understanding, the issue is not God, it's you, because He's always ready to give it to you. He's always ready to give you the good stuff. And therefore, what you really need to do is keep on seeking and seeking these mountaintop experiences that will somehow shape you enough to say, yes, I'm not good myself, but I'm good through Christ, and that should be the ultimate comfort. And because it just doesn't comfort that much, and you just don't feel the joy of the Lord that much, and you don't feel like God's wrapping His warm fatherly arms around you that much, you feel like you're constantly in this race, this rat race with a hamster wheel thing. Like, when am I going to get there? When am I going to hit the mountaintop, or at least feel like I'm safe in my own skin again? And for a lot of us, it just never really comes. And you keep on thinking to yourself, I know the problem. It's me, my theology, my whatever. And you just keep on pursuing it. You'll get there someday. And at worst, when you get to heaven, He'll answer all your questions and comfort you beyond your wildest dreams. But in the meantime, you're just kind of left floundering. At least a lot of us are.
You know, each individual is always the problem. If you have a problem, it's because of you. That there's no question about it. It's always you are the problem. And like you said, when are you ever going to get there? And you don't, because we can always be better, do better, strive better. And there is no good enough. There just isn't. And it's always you. Now, on the flip side of that, it's really wild that abusive men in the church, like if there's heinous crimes, right? And people know about it, all these scandals, crimes going on, right? It's so wild to me to think, as much as the rest of us were really trying to being good, and then you have somebody who's like in a place of leadership and abusing trust in the congregation and with children and preying on them and abusing them, things that we all know are very, very deeply wrong, right? And that is condemned in scripture and is completely against their morals, right? Those people, they are not the problem. It is wild that the rest of us all are. But then when it comes to this really huge sin, apparently they aren't the problem. Everyone else is. The victims are. And glory to God, right? Because I think this is the common denominator, that God is never the problem. Their theology of who God is never the problem. And they protect God's reputation, which is more of their worldview, their foundation, at all costs. Because if they really allowed themselves to deal with things and to think about things, all of it would come crashing down. And they can't have that. And so that's why there's so many scandals, so many cover-ups, all this blame on the victim, because they have to protect the abuser as if they're protecting God.
Yeah.
Why? So they don't have an identity crisis. That's really it. That's it. And God doesn't need protection. God doesn't need protection. Number one, because he's made up anyway. Number two, because if their God was real, he doesn't need his little minions to protect his name. He's bigger than that, right? No, it's pure selfish reasons that they don't want to lose their church. They don't want to lose their power. They don't want to lose their control. They don't, they don't want to have an identity crisis. They don't want to lose their beliefs. And so it's so much easier to push it off because, with an abuser, they think, right, the gospel, if you break it down, the gospel is God can take the worst, most vilest sinner and save him, right? It's like this rescuing thing. And if God can take this person and declare him holy, well, then that's good for the rest of us. It's like this example of, well, if God saves this person, he can save the rest of us too. And I think that really feeds into a lot of why they protect an abuser, right? Because why they just push things under the rug and like almost still glorify this dangerous person in the church. And it's because of glory be to God, he can save them. This guy said he's sorry. He won't do it again, even though he will. And it's just this facade of, see, this is even an example of why our beliefs are true. And it's just this mind warp, right? That doesn't make sense. And then it damages the victims even further and then alienates them and pushes them away and silences them and really takes away their ability to get help and to heal. It does the exact opposite of what they want it to do.
I just add up with what you said about, God being in the same vein as a abusive person. I often like to tell my kids, in terms of protecting their minds from Christianity, I'll say, sin isn't a thing, and therefore salvation isn't a thing. But if it were in some ways real, that there were such a thing as sin, and that salvation was an important part of what we need to think through, I say to them, the biggest sinner in the world would be Yahweh, and he would be the person in most need of salvation. And they get that because we talk through, like, he's the guy that's killed the most kids. He's the guy that's murdered the most people. He's the one that is insisting on these bizarre sexual things like genital mutilation and, sex slaves. He's the one that commits genocide and commands it. He's the one that says stone people. On and on it goes. And, and of course, just the salvation story that you've talked about so eloquently, the idea of basically condemning the whole world for just being human, for struggling, for needing to grow up and learn wisdom. You end up condemning them and making people basically never be able to be safe in their own skin. Like, if that character were real, he'd be the sinner and he would need salvation. He need to get salvation from his own wrath. And it's really crazy to think about. But when you step back at it and look at it from the bigger picture, in my opinion, that's really a truism. It sounds kind of silly to say it that way, but I think it's actually true. He's the biggest character that's causing all this pain, and obviously he's not real. But the fact that we all grew up adopting this sense that yes, this character is real. We all just, he's real. That and if you say he's not real, then you're just denying reality, and you're just trying to harbor sin in your heart. But because we all think that it's true, he becomes kind of real in our minds. And when you step back and say, all right, well, if he was really real, how should we critique that character? And he really is a psychopath. He really is.
That brings me up to, it reminds me of when I was struggling, like in the process of getting out of that belief system. And I had a very, very, very unhealthy relationship with the imaginary character of Jesus. And like that even traumatized me, is how personal and how real my relationship with Jesus was. And when everything started crumbling, I was very, very angry. Of what, like, how do I even think about that? Like, how do I process this? Right. And then because I felt so close to this personality that I created in my mind of Jesus, um, and all I was thinking about all of that kind of stuff that you were saying. And I thought, wait a second. And I was reading in the Bible, I think it was in Isaiah, that said, I I am the good things, like I create the good things, but I also create evil. Like it says that in there. And Isaiah talked about, I think it was Isaiah, talked about those, God being the creator of both goodness and evil coexist. And that was a very hard concept for people to understand. And that was really the first time that it was like sinking in, and I allowed myself to say that. But I didn't think those thoughts that you were talking about, like that God is responsible for all of that, until I read those verses. And a lot of my processing was because I did believe the Bible and I was reading it how they taught me to read it, which was literally. And I would come across these verses that were kept away from us, that were never talked about. And I would and I would say to my husband at the time, I'm, look, in black and white, are you reading what I'm reading? Does it say that? Like, am I crazy? Like, does it actually say that? And he was like, yeah, it says that. And I'm like, that is crazy. Like, that is revolutionary. Like, how? That goes against everything that we were taught. And there was, every single day was just, my mind was being blown open just from reading the Bible, because it went against everything, our foundation of what we were taught that the Bible said.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm just reading this in black and white, and that's what it says, because that's how I was taught to read it and to accept it as the word of God. And it says in the prophets that I create evil. And
Yeah.
I did a word study on forgiveness. And most of the time that forgiveness and mercy is mentioned, it is talking about God being forgiven, about mercy being applied to God. And that was one of my first studies. And I was like, what? It wasn't talking about forgiving humans. It was talking about forgiving God. And I couldn't wrap my head around it at the time. And it took a lot of processing, a lot of Bible studies, a lot of, a lot of thinking about it. And so when I came to that time that I was ready, I was starting to be ready to let go of everything that I was taught, of what they said things are. And I was still really confused, but I was like accepting this idea that God creates evil. And if there is the God, that he is the one responsible, not us. And I remember thinking, it was around the same time that Syria, like everything that, like ISIS was happening. It was like 2016 or whatever. And ISIS was terrorizing, and Syria was going through stuff, and like children were being sent out with bombs. And, there was a little boy that made the headlines. And like, I just saw this picture of this beautiful, bloodied little boy. And I like, that just snapped me. That was my breaking point. And I said, I demand to know why it would be acceptable to put your children in a minefield, like in a bomb field, that they're going to be in danger. Like,
Yeah.
why would that happen? And, with all the trauma, with just the fact that death exists, at all. It is a lot of anxiety inducing, and to say the least. And if God created this perfect world, and then we were told, yes, it's your fault, right, that sin exists, it's because of humans. But from my reading in scripture, it wasn't the human's fault, it was ultimately God's fault. So reframing that blew me away. And I'm like, okay, if you are responsible for this, I'm putting you on trial. Why did you do it? Why did you create us? And like I said, this relationship I had with Jesus was so intimate, and I mean that in like an emotional, spiritual way, that like I felt betrayed by this character of Jesus that I found comfort and solace in. And now I was like, it was almost like I was angry at my boyfriend kind of thing, that I'm like, I felt so betrayed by someone that I felt knew me inside and out and was there to comfort me. And then to realize that he was actually the monster and creating all of it, I was like, I am not talking to you anymore until you explain yourself. Which,
Hmm.
again, like, my way of how I handled Christianity, my interaction with Christianity, I think was not the normal. And I think a lot of people are just content to just go through the motions and not think about things too deeply. If they do, it's either, yeah, this is bullshit, or, yeah, I'll do this. You're like, yeah, this is the right way to live. And that's as far as it goes. But for me, I thought about everything with a fine tooth comb, and I took it literally. And now I know it's because of my neurodivergency and how I take everything literally, and my adoption trauma. Like, I didn't just believe it. It wasn't just my lifestyle. It was my entire essence. And I poured myself into it. And that's all I could. I was completely obsessed. Like, I was not that kind of person that, like, say one thing and do the other. Like, I was pure about it, like,
Hmm.
and I held myself to high standards. And so Jesus was real to me, like he was a real person. And probably in a very unhealthy way, but I think it did aid in my ability to process things and what the beliefs are actually saying, because it's so easy to cover up how dangerous things are when you don't take it very seriously.
Yeah.
Right. But
Hmm.
then when you do take it really seriously, and like you can feel it in your body because you're so obsessed with it, you can, those beliefs are very, very important, because you see the extreme damage that it can cause.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful for my unique way of how I interacted with Christianity, because I can really feel it and see it from the inside out. And again, it brings us back to, if all of that stuff is true, God is the one that's responsible, not us.
Hmm.
If there is grace, it's because we were never responsible on an eternal level in the first place. And here's the thing too, okay? This is also how I look at it. Again, a little bit for my logical standpoint, also being autistic. Okay, so if you have the earth, man-made laws, right? How we are social standards and how we interact with each other, right? We have man-made laws in how we relate and interact with each other down here. And then you have what the church brings on is eternity outside of earth, right? That's eternal standards. Okay. We live down here on earth. We can be accountable for the things that we do here on the earth realm, right? And how if we break laws, we should face the consequences of that, whatever it is. Social standards, right? We break trust with someone, we're going to feel those consequences. But when it comes to eternity and to a like a standard that exists outside of earth, that's on God, not on us. If we have to, he has to break through heaven to get down to earth to talk to us and then pull us outside of earth and bring us back to eternal standards. We don't live in eternity yet. We live on the earth. So if anybody is held to eternal standards, it is God. He's the one that lives in eternity, not us. And so for me, it really helps me in really understanding grace, which is wild, right? Because we're talking about how it was so hard to understand grace growing up in that, because it's abstract and it was constantly performance based, even though they preached grace, but it wasn't ever, we couldn't feel it, right? But once I really understood that from like this wild concept that it's really God who is responsible for this, like that weight that I felt of growing up under the gospel, that lifted off my shoulders, that I felt like humanity is allowed to be human. And we don't have eternal consequences for that. And I can have compassion and I can have grace. And I like not just for myself, but for my fellow human being, that it's hard down here and we only know what we know, and we're not going to be held to eternal standards if they're even different than down here.
Well, you really bring up to the point that this religion, Christianity, number one, it keeps on making claims it just can't back up. And I don't mean like the resurrection, but just like the idea of Jesus says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. So many of us would say we tried for I mean, I was in it for 43 years. Like it wasn't. No matter what I did or didn't do or tried or didn't try, it was never an easy yoke. It was never a light burden. And one of the phrases that came up early in my deconstruction and deconversion that I really kind of attached to, it wasn't me that thought of it first, it was someone else, but people were saying the phrase Christianity broke my heart. And I think that really encapsulated a lot for me. And I think it says a lot to what you're saying of just we thought this was so real, but when we get down to it, this character that we thought was our divine father, he was just really a bad character, and we were set up to fail. And I think even it's amazing when you look back at this stuff and you think, why didn't I see that and that and that? But even just something as simple as looking at the Garden of Eden, like in depth, and thinking, okay, so you create this garden with people that are basically like babies spiritually and emotionally, and you put the enemy of their souls, or give the enemy of their souls access to them. Like what parent's going to say, here's a garden, go play with your toys in the backyard, and by the way, there's like a boa constrictor and a hungry lion out there. Like nobody in the right mind would do that, and yet they did that. And obviously there's a lot more to it than I'm oversimplifying, but just this sense of the harshness of and the bizarre contrast, like God is this good father, and yet he's willing to treat you so badly for some reason. Like when you're in it from the earliest days, you just can't see it. And I think too, like you're saying, with the bigger picture of the cosmos and heaven versus earth, like when you realize that God did create this world foreknowing, according to the theology of the Bible, knowing that the angels or some of them would fall, and that some of them would end up becoming Satan and the demons, and that they would create such havoc and cause us to question God in turn. Like if that worldview had been correct, then God foreknew that he would be creating this army of people that would basically end up with us being tortured forever. So why not just either not create them or create them in a way that they can't ever fall or disobey like robots, or why not create us in a way that we are able to see past the bullshit and say, yes, God, we see the sin versus righteousness choice, and it's an easy choice. We'll pick righteousness. But why let people that are basically spiritual, emotional children, immature people from God's perspective, put the weightiest things on their plate and say, if you don't make the right choice, I'm gonna get you good. That's horrific to think about. And no parent would do that, especially when you think about the horrors of what is at stake, especially in the Christian worldview that includes
Yeah.
the horrors of hell. And I like to say to my
Mhm.
kids, again, protecting their minds, I'd be like, if I said to you, I want you to do something like clean up your room, and I said, you don't do it. If I took your finger and I put a cast iron pan on real hot, I put your finger on the cast iron pan for just a second, would I be a good daddy or a bad daddy? And they'd say, oh, of course you'd be a bad daddy. And I kind of up it a little bit without getting, nightmarish. Like, what if I held your hand on there, for a whole minute and your whole hand is like burning up? Would I be a good daddy or a bad daddy? And they get it. Like, they're like, you'd be a horrible daddy. I'm like, well, how is Yahweh then a good daddy? Because he's doing that, but exponentially worse.
Yeah.
But you can't see it. But once you do realize it, you're like, oh my gosh, this thing broke my heart. I was tricked into believing he was that the most abusive character, arguably in history, was the most loving character. That's a mind job.
Yeah. Yeah. It goes deep. It goes deep into the psyche, and it affects everything. It affects how abusive men are able to, work the system and stay in power. It affects how they're able to mind control victims. It affects, our parenting. It affects everything. And man, that also reminded me of hell was very real to me. As real as Jesus was to me and the comfort that he gave me, hell was equally as real. And that also shaped a lot of how I interacted with it. Um, to bring it to modern day times, I've been thinking about this last couple days, that I don't know how much of Gaza is in your news feed, but in mine, it's
Quite a bit.
like, you have a lot of very compassionate humanitarians, activists who are just screaming about Gaza 24/7, right? And it's like they don't want you to talk about anything else. Like, how can you enjoy anything? Because we're witnessing genocide in front of our faces through our screens. And it's horrific. And it truly is hell on earth. And it triggers me in like PTSD, because that level of disturbance, uh, that's how I felt with hell. Like, I don't believe, well, I do believe that the majority of Christians who go to church, they really don't believe in hell. It's just, I think a lot of us who have really lived it and escaped Christianity have been the true believers, that we took it seriously. And I think in order to stay in it somewhat, you have to not believe, because it is messed up. Because if anyone truly believes in hell, you'd be like those activists. Like, you can't enjoy anything in life if you know that hell is real.
Yeah.
That flames are like I could not see a person, anybody, without envisioning them being engulfed in flames forever and screaming. Like,
Mm.
my mind would terrorize me. Like, I would get these every time when I'm talking to someone, like 15 years ago, I was talking to you, I'd be talking to you and imagining you being terrorized through fire.
Mm.
And
You're the first person that said that, because I've said that same exact thing quite a bit. Do you know the movie, was it Carrie? some old Stephen King movie where the girl could, in her anger, just think and make people kind of, be in flames, and obviously with special effects. But that concept of seeing somebody in flames, even though it was special effects in that movie, I did the same thing you're talking about, and I would see people that way. Like I purposefully
Yeah.
tried to, like, if I stopped doing that, I was like, you got to get back to that because you need to see that's how scary this is.
Yeah. And it keeps you in there from like pushing the gospel and saving souls and, furthering the church's agenda. But it is 1000% traumatizing believing that and seeing people that way and actually loving people. Like, I for real love people. Like, it's not just like, I see the beauty and fascination with everybody. I'm just like, oh, like I just naturally love people. And to have that coexist at the same time of being traumatized at the thought of like having these visions constantly in my head whenever I see somebody that I love and I care for, like that's another level of like of trauma and yeah, and terror. And so this whole thing with Gaza, I think is um it's really hard for me because it mirrors so similarly to the belief in hell, except this is real and this is happening and hell wasn't.
Yeah. And but also
You
at
know?
the same exact time too, adding on the thought that both for the hell concept as well as the Gaza situation, from many Christians' perspectives, they would say, yes, it's sad, but they deserve it. And at the end, you would, like, I remember, I forget where the verse is, but there's a verse that talks about in the Bible, that we will rejoice when God does ultimately inflict judgment. Like, it's a sense of like saying, yes, God is loving, but at the same time, He's also holy. And the strong message in the Old Testament, of course, holy, holy, holy. He's so holy that people can't see him. They have to have wings around their eyes to just hide from the light. He is so holy, and that someday when we are able to see the world the way God does, and see sin the way God does, that we will agree with Him on all things in heaven, and that He will say, "It is a good thing that I enact righteous judgment on these people," which includes, in that theology, hell. And Christians basically saying the same thing, that just like people in hell will deserve it fully, and we will be sad for them, but they will deserve it. That the people in Gaza are the same thing; they deserve this, and it's amazing. And I've said a lot, and I think it carries through. When you believe monstrous ideas long enough, you kind of become a monster.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it goes hand in hand with Christian nationalism. And I really feel like we're keep coming to accumulation of the past so many decades, even the past like century, of a political agenda that's very far right. And of course, what we're seeing now post Trump is people are much more quick to enact these monstrous beliefs or to have so extreme that they're just so far disengaged from humanity that they can look at obvious human, dehumanization and be just so desensitized that they look at something so evil and like it.
Yeah,
And that just tears me up. Like, I cannot understand that. I understand it as far as mind control and propaganda. And I understand it from that point of view. And I understand it from beliefs point of view. And I get it. But like, there's got to be a heart under there somewhere where you like, because if it was happening to you, if it was happening, those are the same kind of people that would hate themselves for being in that situation and experiencing, like, they wouldn't let themselves experience that kind of, right? Experience that kind of humiliation. They're like, no, I would fight and I wouldn't let them do that to me because they're not going to disrespect me like that, right? They would never let it happen, want that to happen to them. And yet they can look at someone else who is same flesh and blood as them and like it. I just can't. Like,
It's like the golden rule doesn't apply suddenly.
yeah, like, how far removed from your humanity do you have to be? That it's absolutely like, for people are being traumatized and terrorized around the world just from Gaza happening, right? Like, every day it's in our feed and we're all having an emotional reaction to it. And then like, if that weren't bad enough, now you're dealing with all these random people on the internet who are very real in real life that vote, and they like it. Like, that is also traumatizing because we got to coexist with them. Like, we're trying to coexist on this planet and create, all together recreating this society that affects human policy, how humans are treated, wars, all of that. And we got to coexist with people who hate humanity that much. And it is just so beyond disturbing. Like, it's emotionally too much, and then to constantly hear the stories and the relatives and all this stuff. It's really, having gone through this spiritual experience of Christianity on a very emotional level, and then having to deal with world affairs and all this stuff that's happening in the internet, and to watching people's values just plummet,
Yeah.
and are excited about it, like, are happy about it, and just in your face bold about it. It's just, it is heartbreaking on a very basic level. Like,
And it's not like
it
there's a
just
God
tears you up.
imposing, yeah, and it's not like there's a God imposing this stuff on us. This is literally just us doing this to ourselves. We're just basically indoctrinating ourselves. But looking at it from the scope of humanity as a whole, there's nobody forcing us to be these monsters. We're just doing it to
No.
ourselves, and we're literally hurting our own flesh and blood, as it were. And it's amazing to me how much Christianity claims to be pro-life, and yet so often they're pro-death. It blows my mind.
Yes. Yes. And again, it comes back to the propaganda. And I truly believe that, like, in my studies and trying going deeper with this, and like I said, going through this with a fine-tooth comb, I find Christianity completely irreversibly linked to um to white supremacy and capitalism, the amoral capitalism, our economy. I mean, it is a billions of dollars industry, just religion alone.
Yeah.
And it actually is worth more than Apple and, I think, Google, like the tech industry. I believe it's like the religion's net worth in America is worth more than the tech industry.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
And people, like, I just see all of these things intrinsically connected, like patriarchy, um, you know, just tied with money and power is just in everything. And why? And it's to keep the people in power, to secure their positions of power,
Yeah.
and because they don't want to lose it. And it's just so intrinsically connected. And if you look at, American history and how it all came about, these things were thought out. Like, it was even written down. Like, even with racism, they used religion to spiritually enslave, um, you know, the slaves so they wouldn't fight back, and so that they would allow themselves to be degraded like that. And I say those words very loosely because I'm speaking like from a white supremacist slave owner words, right? And I have a book on my bookcase about it, how they use Christianity to keep the slaves in their place.
Yeah,
Like,
I think even editing the Bible in different ways so that some verses that would talk about freedom were not there, but the ones about slavery were highlighted or something.
yeah, and the King James version was a political motivation. That translation was for political reasons. King James, like author, like he did that for political reasons, for his own securement of his title. And it's so crazy to me. Like it's just so interconnected. And when you and then just seeing the modern times and going back through the last 100 years of American history and how they played the long game. Like this, like coming to where we are now politically was thought out a long time ago. And they worked hard for it, and they played the long game, and they took the steps necessary, and which leads to Christian nationalism, right? And talk show radio and all of this stuff that I say that we were trained to be soldiers for Christ. That a lot of like there's a high value of having a lot of children to so that you could pass on Christianity and outnumber the liberals. And so they had children for political reasons. They just did, and they're upfront about it.
Yeah, outbreed and outvote the pagans for sure.
Yes.
Can I ask? I did want to. I know we've talked about some of these. I did want to make sure I gave a little bit more time to also bring it back to your story. What was it like to like? What were the final weeks or months or whatever where you actually finally moved past Christianity? Like, what got you out at the end? And did you try to get like? Was it like I'm out? Oh no, I'm that bad choice. I'm back in. How was that? Did you waver at all? And just what were the emotions like at that time? And just I'm curious about what the actual
Yeah.
final moments were like.
Oh boy. Okay. So like I said, I was really deep into it. That was like not normal. And I also had a lot of other personal things happening in my life, like we all do. My adoption played a lot into it, but I was also undiagnosed, uh, autistic, ADHD. And then I kept having all these babies. Like I just was in it, right? And I also loved my role as a mother and vowed myself to keep having babies and leaving it up to God. And
Wait, was it
the
like the
little
goal
quiver.
of having little soldiers for Jesus kind of thing?
Yeah, but I wouldn't say for me it was politically motivated. It was more like loving, like spreading loving goodness
Yeah,
kind of thing, like raising them right, and then they're going to be good humans kind of
gotcha.
thing. Um, but yeah, I was just like allowing my body to be used by God and however He wanted to, right? That whole complete surrender. My pregnancies were from hell. They were terrible. I had lots of conditions that like took me out. I had to parent from the couch most of my parenting because I was so sick. I could not keep my head up. I couldn't stand up or else I'd black out. I was puking all the time. Like I didn't have any help, no support. And I just had to like manage somehow and keep myself alive somehow
Wow.
while I was parenting these kids. But my kids, because it's genetic, are also neurodivergent and also undiagnosed. And neurodivergent kids are completely different breed. Like parenting them is completely different. And I knew early on that like the traditional parenting was not going to work on my kids. And before I left Christianity, I was starting to be shunned already within the Christian circle just because my parenting was different. because I had to, thankfully, had enough sense to change my parenting based on my children. But it was pure chaos. And parenting neurodivergent children, especially under the age of 5, and I had multiple of them, was complete chaos and very hard. And they would trigger me, and then I would have an autistic meltdown, and like all that, like it was just like a nightmare. And then I'm also physically sick. So I have a lot of trauma, not just from the whole spiritual side of things, not just from the adoption, everything, but even just those early years of where I was so sick in my pregnancies and me undiagnosed, trying to parent undiagnosed multiple young children. That in itself was extremely traumatic. But it also pushed me to go deeper into spiritually. And as, like I said, I had to rethink things because what I was doing wasn't working. So I had to push myself. Well, how do I make it work? What is good for them? So parenting that way brought up a lot of questions that caused me to dig deeper. And like I said, hell was a big factor in believing in hell, that I was constantly thinking about that 24/7, and I was scared about my kids. And I hit a wall where I couldn't relate to anyone. I mean, my story is so different. And any one of those things that people go through changes them forever. But like I had multiple of those challenges all at once. And it was just way too much. And I became completely unrelatable to people. So as much as I loved people and I was fascinated by them and I was like, yes, I want the best for you, there was like no way I could interact because nobody could relate to me because I was so far out there. And that also bothered me in Christianity because I'm like, Jesus was the friend of sinners, right? And I'm like, Jesus, I know how much comfort I get from Jesus. And so if we're supposed to be like Jesus, we should be able to be friends with people who aren't like us. But I knew that there's a barrier there and I couldn't understand it and I didn't know why. Looking back, it's pretty obvious, but at the time I didn't know. And I wanted to be relatable, but there was this moment where it felt like I was just pinned in a corner. And I didn't know my place in the world anymore. And I didn't know what to do because I just have flashes of hell all the time. That was like really, really bothering me at that moment. And my birth father had passed away. And I was also going through that. And I was just like, I don't know how I'm going to get out of this. Like, I feel like I went to the edge of Christianity and it got me nowhere. Like it was a dead end. And I didn't know how to get out, but I wanted to. And I was like, I want to live in such a way that I can have relationships with people of how I actually feel about them, which I think people are pretty cool. And I wanted like that normal interaction. I'm like, I just want to be normal, but I couldn't because I had so much weight and pressure on me and so much trauma. And my best friend at the time, she was going through, like, we kind of deconstructed and processed Christianity together. And she said, Wren, I got to tell you something. There's something that I've been thinking for a long time and I haven't told you about it yet, but my husband has really been going through stuff and he's been asking questions about Christianity and what we believe. And she's like, he came to me and he said, I don't think hell is real. And she was like, so we were digging through it together. And she's like, I don't think I believe in hell anymore. Now, this is when I'm just like crying out to God, like, help me, because this is too much. Like, I feel like I'm backed into a corner and hell is just like traumatizing me. And then she's like, I don't think hell is real. And she's like, I want you to study it. She's like, we've been best friends. We trust each other. I want you to look into this too, to see if hell's not real. And I was like, you're my best friend. I trust you, but I want nothing more than to believe that hell isn't real. But I will check into it, but I'm going to tell you, I don't know any other way to look at it. And we might have to come to the conclusion of we'll have to agree to disagree because I don't know any other way to look at it. So I read Rob Bell's book, Love Wins. And then I read Francis Chan's book that he wrote in rebuttal to it. And I read them back to back. And I was getting ready to have my 5th baby. And I came to my friend after and I was like, I checked it out. I read these 2 books and I still think that hell is real. And Francis Chan's book made more sense to me. And I was like, I'm sorry, I don't know. Like, I don't want hell to be real, but I don't know how else to look at it. And she's like, okay, and I didn't know. Like, I don't think I would have pulled myself out of it because I was so far into it, I couldn't see any other way. And it was the morning or right before I gave birth to my 5th baby that my father passed away in November and this was February. And this is like so crazy and I don't have any explanation for it other than maybe it was my brain, whatever. But it felt like my father found a way to contact me through space and time. And he came to me in a dream and he said, I got to tell you something. Like, there's something really important that I want you to know. And I remember like thinking, I couldn't even understand what he was telling me. Like, I couldn't pay attention to what he was saying because I was so shocked that I was talking to him in a dream, that I saw him and he just had this like glow about him. Like everything that was physically wrong with him wasn't there anymore. And he looked so different. And I was finally able to really connect with him, like as my father. And I was just so shocked about that it was even happening in a dream that I couldn't understand what he was saying. But he like told me all this stuff, whatever. And then at the end, he said, I know you're getting ready to go have your baby, and I'm so proud of you. And then I woke up, and then it was time to go to the hospital. And I was like, what just happened? Like, what? And then I was like, I have no explanation for it. Like, in our sect of Christianity, dreams and visions were not a thing. Like, you weren't supposed to have them. They were from the devil kind of stuff. So the fact that I experienced one, I was like, I don't know what that was, but I feel connected to my father now. Like, when I think of him, I don't think of who he was on this earth. I think of him in my dream and like beyond earth. And because I didn't have a strong connection with him down here, and now I do. And it's just like, it was very healing. But at the same time, I was like, I don't know what he said to me, but it was a good experience and I don't understand it, but I'm happy it happened. Fast forward to Easter. It was wild. It was so wild. I kind of had another like vision that was not acceptable within our Christian circle. And it was like I was taken up in this whirlwind, and like all the information of the world and everything that happened within the space of humanity, it was just kind of like I was taking up in this whirlwind and like seeing it all. And then at the end, everything's okay. Like everything's okay. We're all okay. We all really do love each other. And it was almost like there was this spell on us, and then the spell was broken, and it was just this wild thing. And I remember at the end of it, I just laughed hysterically for a week. And it was then that I realized hell isn't real. And it's just this made up thing that we did to each other down here. And it felt like a big scam, but it was it was like we were in a play. And at the end, like, yeah, it's like we're in a play. And then at the end, everything's okay. And we were all just acting, we just all had our roles. And I still can't explain all of that. And I don't even looking back like now, I still don't even believe in all that kind of stuff. I don't know what I believe, but it was that kind of stuff that like supernaturally, I guess, got me out of it to be able to see another perspective.
Mm.
And it was really wild for me. It was extremely like jarring, not just for me, but for everyone else, because I used to say to God, like, if you don't want everyone to know, don't tell me. Because whatever I openly deconstructed on Facebook, like whatever I was learning at the time, I put it on blast. So people watched me deconstruct. And going through all those like wild experiences, I was like, oh no, like I wrote about it on Facebook, and I was laughing. Like I was the happiest I'd ever been. I remember coming out of the room and telling my kids, I got good news. Hell is not real. And they're like, it's not. And I was like, no, we can, this is great. Like there's no more fear, no more anxiety. Like hell is not real. And they're like, yes. They're like, oh, phew. And then I was like, I don't know. I was so naive. I thought people were going to be happy for the idea that hell isn't real, because I was so happy. I was like, it was like I was high because I was so happy. I was acting completely insane that people thought I really went mental. But like
Mm.
that's how much anxiety I had. And when you take all that anxiety and then just replace it with that much equal or greater joy, I was through the roof happy. And so I
Mm.
remember I posted like, your prayers are answered. Hell isn't real. And so all of that concern for your relatives who have passed on and you think they're in hell, they're fine. Like your prayers are answered. Everything's good. And I was like, oh, this is great. And everyone was like, this is the worst day of my life. I had some like they were legit concerned for me. And I remember someone was like, if I don't believe in hell, I will go there. And
Wow.
I'm like, that doesn't even make sense. Because if it's not real, how are you gonna go there? But that's how they trap them. But I remember like people are arguing with me and they're so mad. And I'm just like, I took a selfie and I'm like, look, I'm having like such a great time. I was like, I love this. I laughed for a whole week straight. I was just on such an incredible high because that weight was lifted. And
Mm.
I can't even contribute it to my own processing because something had to happen in my brain to get me to see another perspective because I logically couldn't, even though I desperately wanted to. And it took that crazy experience, those two separate times, for me to finally see another perspective. And like I said, I'm not going to even try to understand what that was or if it was real or not. I don't care. Like it got me out of it, you know?
Mm. It's like
So yeah,
you're blindfolded, and for the first time in your life, you found a way to take the blindfolds off, and it just happens to be, that at that moment you're standing on the beach and it's sunset. It's like, oh my gosh, the world is beautiful. Or looking at the, stars at night when there's no city lights around. It's like, this is a beautiful place if you let it, but we've just been so blinded. And I was very much did it like I felt that overwhelming need to almost laugh. I don't think I laughed out loud, but just I felt giddy in the first hour. And
Mhm.
I know people struggle with the sadness sometimes of it. And I get that. But for me, I literally, like, I described it almost immediately as I feel like I just won the lottery. Number one,
Yes.
because I was in such a bad thing. But number two, I could have
Mhm.
easily imagined that if the chips had fallen differently, I could have stayed in it and also passed it on.
Mhm.
And to think, oh my
Yeah,
gosh, I could have gone to my deathbed in this mythology. Oh my, like, this is
absolutely.
crazy. And that made me overjoyed. And it definitely mitigated the pain of like Christianity
Yes.
broke my heart. But enough already. It's like if you were dating somebody that was hyper abusive and they didn't really care if you lived or died, but whenever you interacted with them, they kind of abused you. And you're like somehow Stockholm syndrome, and you're just like you would love you're this abuser, but then you're like you wake up and you're like, what the hell was I doing? This person's awful. And then like the next step, the next week you meet the person that's the most loving, truly non-abusive person in the world. You're like, what was I thinking? Why did I want that? And it's like life just becomes, and I think too, realizing that you truly are better than all these stories. Like if you say, well, God is so gracious, suddenly you become more gracious. It's like God is so forgiving. Well, he couldn't forgive without magic blood. I can just say, I forgive you, and the story's over. Why can't he do that? And you realize you're
Yeah.
truly better than God on all kinds of levels. And it
Mhm.
blows your mind, but it's a party. It really is. It's not like, and not in a superficial sense, like it's the most cathartic experience that I've ever gone through.
Yeah, it's wild. And yeah, I've seen a lot of people who have come out of deconstruction and they're just so depressed and it really like throws off their entire world, and which it also did mine. Like it launched me into a domestic violence situation
Hmm.
and affected my custody arrangement of my kids because there's like no worse thing than a liberal woman within the church, right? And um like my world was devastated because I deconstructed from Christianity. But all of that, as emotional and hard as it was, I was just so happy to get out. I was so happy, and my quality of life just grew exponentially because I no longer had these monstrous beliefs tied to me anymore.
Hmm.
And I was just so happy. It was like the happiest day of my life to finally imagine a world without hell.
Hmm.
It was, yeah.
It's like
And
getting out of a prison that you kind of wanted to get out of, but you didn't really even know you were in it, and you couldn't kind of see it. And suddenly you could see it, and you see that you've got the key, and you escape, and you're like, it's a truly Twilight Zoney, almost otherworldly experience. But I think too, just
yeah,
the freedom, then you realize the ramifications of. I mean, it's to me it was depressing to lose heaven, but like the ramifications of like, yeah, but none of this worldview matters. So like you're free to figure out what you want to do with your life,
and
and
that
no,
part I think was confusing to me because everything that we were taught was wrong and immoral. No, suddenly everything was fair game.
yeah,
And everything that we taught was righteous. Now I saw that as evil.
yes,
And I was like, my guidelines for morality were so confusing to me. Like I was like, I don't know which way is up anymore. And that part was confusing to me as I'm like trying to figure things out. And I don't want to raise my kids as sheltered as I was. But, it's like, it's hard as a parent when you're still trying to figure out right and wrong for yourself. Like, how are you supposed to know what's right and wrong for your kids? And I think that's when I created Kaleidoscope Island because I was like, I got to figure out what's up. Like I need some way to stand on because everything was decided for us based on the gospel. And when that wasn't necessary anymore, I was like, how do I decide these things? Like, where is my compass? And so yeah, going back to like God being responsible for everything, and I was like, I demand to know why you created Earth like this, right? And so I sat down and I wrote the fantasy short story about Kaleidoscope Island. And that was very exciting for me because I felt like if I could just sit down and write a story about the origins of Earth that I just literally made up in my head, how is that any different than religious leaders who make stuff up about theology and creation and everything else? They're just, it's on the equal playing field. Anything goes. They can make stuff up, I'll make stuff up. And to me, like, Kaleidoscope Island it's definitely not my compass, my moral code of how I wanted one to be there. But it was more my, like, stick it to religion, that, like, make up your own shit. Like, make up your own story, whatever is comforting to you about that dissonance, that we are beautiful, fascinating beings that exist in a place where there is death and pain and suffering. And it's like, whatever you have to do to find comfort in those things, in the fact that these two things coexist, that I think that is really our goal. The core of our being that affects everything else is we need to find some kind of peace and comfort within ourselves that allow love and evil to coexist at the same time. And that is hard. Because that, like, death and evil goes against the goodness that we are. And there's got to be some kind of answer, some kind of way to justify those things without being desensitized to the trauma that it is, right? We don't want, like, toxic positivity, but there's got to be some kind of way that these two things can coexist. And that if there is a God that is responsible, eternally responsible, for allowing pain and death and suffering to coexist with our love and our goodness, I think that's really the issue, is like, maybe that after all, we do forgive God. Maybe after all, that there is mercy. And that's what my Kaleidoscope Island was about. And to me, if all of that stuff is true, which I highly doubt, but let's just pretend that Jesus on the cross actually did happen, and Jesus really did take on the sins of the world, that he did it for us, right? Let's pretend that that's true. The only way that I can wrap my head around that is that when Jesus died for our sins, it wasn't ours. Like, he was saying, this isn't your this isn't yours to atone for. This is mine. That was, to me, the death of Jesus. The only way that it could be true would be that God was taking responsibility and accountability for the evil that was done and allowed himself to go through the punishment of it. And the punishment being that how Jesus was treated, right? Being whipped, and the anger and the hatred of humanity unleashed on Jesus, to me, is the same thing as what we were saying. God is responsible for this. He's the monster. And it's that same thing of, like, yeah, we demonize this monster that has created all the evil in the world. And to me, it was okay. Like, because if God is real and love is also just as equally real as evil, then God can handle accountability. God is bigger than us being mad at him. And that it's our anger is justified.
Hmm.
It's okay. It's okay to be angry at God. And if God has seen all this, he is, he's omniscient and all knowing, and he is the one that's responsible for all the shit in the world. It's okay to be angry about it. It's part of healing. And God is bigger, that he can handle our accusations. He can handle the weight of accountability, and to face it and be like, yeah, I did that.
Hmm.
And that's why Jesus could, if that story is true, that's why Jesus didn't fight back. It was okay. And he accepted it. Like, he's just like, okay, like, it was me. Like, it was me. It wasn't you. You know, yes, on earth, we are accountable according to earth standards for what we do, but eternal ones, God is the one responsible. And so he took on our anger, and he became accountable for all of the evil. And I think that's, if that the cross is about anything, to me, the only way I can understand it is that Jesus dying on the cross was him taking responsibility and accountability for all the evil that's been done here.
Hmm.
And that to me was what I wrote about in Kaleidoscope Island. I didn't even understand that until I was writing Kaleidoscope Island. Like, I didn't I didn't think anything through. I just started writing, and like whatever came to me. And like, that's how it was revealed to me in my thought process. And I just cried. And I was just like cried in gratefulness. And I was like, whoa. And to me, that's that the choice isn't, do you accept Jesus in your heart? Do you want to be changed from being a sinner to being righteous? To me, if there is a question for humanity, it's, if God is really the one responsible, are you going to forgive God or not?
Hmm.
And the overwhelming, like, the joy of, even if that is the question, the grand question that we ask people, would you forgive God if he was responsible for all this? The answer still doesn't even matter. You can be angry at God. You can choose to be angry at God, and that's okay. You can choose to forgive God and choose mercy and goodness, and that's okay. Because at the end of the day, we are still on earth, and we have a limited understanding, and all emotions are valid and sacred. And it's part of the healing process. If you have to be angry at God, be angry. If you want to walk in seeing things through a lens of love and light, go for it, because if God is real and all of this perspective is true, just for funsies, he's still bigger than our forgiveness of him. And at the
Hmm.
end of the day, we are all connected in our existence. And if there is an existence outside of earth, at the end, we'll be all connected in the end anyway. So
Hmm.
it doesn't matter. It's just how you feel about it is just your stage and where you're at right now. And it's fluid, it's moving. We're constantly moving through our feelings, and it's all valid, and it's okay. You don't have to be anywhere.
Hmm. I love your creativity, and I can definitely sort of emotionally ditto the idea that when you deconvert, it brings so much emotion that if you're at all inclined to do it, the kind of that stream of consciousness dynamic, it just starts coming. And whether it's, for the musicians among us, whether it's music or just poetry or writing, just writing, journaling, whatever it is, drawing, it almost is like deconversion turns us very much into poets and artists because there's so much there. And I love too how you described that book. And I think for a lot of us, because we're so used, even though we can admit this is, in my words, it's all mythology, and there's no reality to the God character,
Exactly.
to say that we can just like spend 40 years or 30 years talking to him in our minds and suddenly just drop him, it doesn't work that fast. And even though you can kind of mentally say, I acknowledge I'm not talking to anybody, it's almost like you have to kind of have a few pretend conversations to kind of say
Mhm.
goodbye, to kind of bury,
Absolutely.
it's like a funeral. It's a funeral for God. And it's not real.
Absolutely.
It's for your emotional well-being, but you kind of have to
Yes.
say, God, this is it's time to say goodbye. And for to be able to write it, the way you did so creatively is awesome. And I think it sounds like it was probably very healing to be able to say your goodbye that way.
Oh yeah, it's still one of my favorite stories. It's just so beautiful. And there's like a beautiful love story in there too that's just like really captivates you, and you just it's very emotional. And it's so funny because I did not think of this, you know, on purpose. It just kind of naturally came out through my writing.
Hmm.
And then I like stepped back and look at the finished product and I was like, whoa, and
That's so
it's
cool.
still such a beautiful, very sacred story to me. But at the same time, like, I made it all up. Like,
Yeah. Well,
I just hold it so loosely.
well, please keep using your creativity. We definitely enjoy it. We need it. On the note of creativity, I did want to ask kind of as a wrap-up question, for anyone that kind of wants to follow what you've been doing and what you're going to be doing. It sounds like you're going to be just as busy in the next year or two. How can they best connect with you, follow you, see what you're doing, and especially with the docuseries and your autobiography, just what's the best way to be involved with what you're involved in?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook the most, Wren Story on Facebook. I'm also on Instagram, simply being Wren. Um, but through the biggest way, I think my project now that I'm working on is the digital magazine, Simply Being, and I've kind of taken all of this, right? That sets the stage for it, and um, and using human rights declarations of human worth declarations, and really seeing the goodness and the value in all of humanity, and how it is unique to each one of us, and also just putting our humanity on display, really, and saying it's okay, we're allowed, it is valuable, and it's worth it to just simply be human, and all of that contain to have the love and the evil coexist. It's this, we are part of this grand story that we cannot escape from. This is reality. Love and evil coexist together, whether we like it or not. And to purposely come back and say, I'm going to choose to enjoy this story of us anyway, and to really put on display the humanity of us, um, and through these declarations and through the highlighting of each person, that this is how to connect. I'd love to feature you as content in the magazine. I've made everything, all the steps so easy, so simple, because I know everyone's busy. And it's just, I ask people one question, and for the magazine, and you just answer the question. And then it shows like there's a thread, or the thread of our humanity runs through each unique response. And it takes you on an experience, right? That emotional experience of expanding our consciousness of what it means to be human, and to allowing that grace, and to allowing boundaries as well, right? Because love and evil coexist. And
Hmm.
for each magazine issue will also be a collab book series. So each magazine issue will have its own book, and that's an expanded version where people will be able to say more of their stories and more of their answers. So
Hmm.
um and that's all on my website on Pensite Wren Story. So all the options are there of how to get involved in the magazine, be content, be featured. If you have to be anonymous, I can do that too, because protecting people and their stories is very important. If someone's in a dangerous situation, but you have a story, we can do anonymous as well. Um, but yeah, would love to feature you as content, or in the book, and all the options are there on on my website. So
That's awesome. And I'll put all the links beneath this video, so please go check it out and like and subscribe and all that. I love too just the idea that the phrase that comes to mind is secular grace. David Ames from Deconversion Anonymous, he talks about that, and just the idea that we can be just as gracious and arguably much more gracious as unbelievers, because we're free of the shackles of this mythology and the tenets of the doctrines and the worldview. But just the idea that we can fight, as it were, for things that we really value, but still fight in a way that is showing kindness and trying to make this world a better place by way of conversations that are hopefully as respectful as they can be and as loving, and trying to make positive influences, but also not trying to be jerks in the process. And I think that's a great reminder.
right. And I think that also shows up in how we feel about like prisoners of war and how we treat them and what we're seeing in Gaza. Right. And even there's a certain level we shouldn't even be treating our enemies in a certain way. We should still treat our enemies, even if we have to go to war with ideology or whatever, we should still be treating them in a humane way with grace and compassion. And sometimes it's hard when people are just like so stubborn and so obnoxious, and we have feelings as well, but I would hope that we can have some kind of value system that stops us from becoming monsters ourselves.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Well, I definitely appreciate your sharing your story today. This has been great. I would love to touch base, especially when your book comes out. You said it's probably next year.
Yeah, it'll be in 2024.
Okay. Well, when it comes out, let me know, and we'll do an interview to kind of help you publicize it and so forth. But thank you so much for sharing your story today. Before we wrap up, did you have any final comments you wanted to add?
I don't think so.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll just wrap up then by saying we've been speaking with Wren Story. Wren, thank you so much for your work and for sharing your story and just for who you are. You're an important voice in our community, and we hope you keep going. And thank you for today.
Well, thank you so much. It was a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.